Now, I want to go back to that. You say number one goal, most important goal, stay married, right? Where does that come from? Because I feel like in today's day and age, most people don't have that foundation in their life of like, I made a commitment here. I
Right.
need to stay married. And I understand things happen. I'm not gonna judge people for that. But I feel like so many times we get married or people get married and then they're like, this isn't working out. I'm just gonna quit it. You know, where does that foundation of stay married, family first come from?
Well, I mean, my parents still married, and they actually got married young. They're still married. My grandparents, same thing. Like both sets of grandparents were married until they got old and one of them died. My brothers got married young. He's still married. It's kind of what we do. That's part of it. The other thing is, especially once you have kids, man, like that's the whole thing. Like that's a major impact, a major. And I'm not suggesting that it's always the right thing to do is to stay married, before the kids because you have kids. Like I think that potentially could cause more damage. But just the being aware, being cognizant, right? Like everything you do, how you treat your spouse. Okay, if you're a male and you have boys, how you treat your spouse is how your boys are going to treat their spouse. If you have little girls, how you treat your spouse is how they are going to accept being treated by their husband, right? And that's important, right? And if so you want to be a good, we want to set a good example. You want them to be, if you want them to have, happy lives, happy marriages, that type of thing, lead by example. And the other thing is, man, you're just happier, man. Like, who wants to live that way? Like, come home to this person that you're mad at, or or is upset with you, or you don't like, or is always on your nerves, or whatever the fuck, right? Like, it sounds terrible. Like, don't you want to live with somebody who you enjoy being around,
Yeah.
and you yeah, and like you can help each other out. And when you're struggling with something, you just like tell them, hey, this is like really hard. I'm going through this. And maybe they have some advice for you. Maybe their advice is shit, but at least it's something. And that's usually not the case. Usually the outside eyes, and it's just I think it's just a better way to live, man.
Yeah. Yeah, my
That's
wife went through a real hard time. Oh,
Less, oh yeah, just so much less stress, happier. And that's ultimately you're gonna perform better if you're in a good spot, if you're not stressing out about something going on at home or whatever. And I think a lot of times, look, I don't know, right? Like I'm not in a marriage where that's not happy or whatever, so I can't like speak to that. But I've seen it a few times where these people are happy and then they're not.
mhm.
So what changed? You know, at one point you loved each other, now you don't, or you're not. So like, but when I've seen that happen, usually it's kind of one of the people is doing something different or making some sort of little change. Maybe it's even like a relatively positive change in their life, but the other person doesn't understand it. And instead of just like communicating and working through it, then they start. Maybe the person's making the change is trying to force it upon their spouse, and maybe their spouse isn't, ready for that or doesn't want anyway, whatever, right? It's just these things kind of happen, and they happen over time where it's like, all of a sudden they look up and they realize that they're in this terrible spot and it's never gonna kind of work out again. But like when you see it from the outside, you're like, oh no, man, this has been past couple of years. It's been a little, like I've seen this happening, right? And so there's that awareness also where if there's something going on, you're not happy, like you need to talk about it. You need to get to the bottom of it. You need to and there's an understanding and there's a wanting the other person to be happy.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important, right? Like it's not about you, right? Like that's ultimately you'll be happier if they're happy.
Yeah.
And so finding that common ground, finding I think that's important.
Yeah, putting your spouse's needs before your own, I
Yeah.
think,
And
because
also if you have those needs, you need to communicate them. I think that's a big issue too, right? Is like it's easy in your own, how many times you argue with someone and they're not even there. Right? Like all the time, you're driving to work and someone cuts you off and you're just like, oh, this motherfucker, right? And it's like, and then you're sitting there and or there's someone at work that you don't get along with, and you're like, oh man, I swear if this like, oh, if this guy looks at me again, or if he says this again, whatever's whole, and you're like having this whole argument with them, they're not even there. And you get there and they're like, good morning. you're like, yeah, fuck you, right? Like you've been, you've been MFing them the whole way up. They didn't even do anything, right? It's all in your own head, and you get all work. I think that happens a lot in people's households. You know,
Hmm.
woman, and the sink's full of dishes again. And it's like, man, every day when I get home, there's a sink full of dishes and I'm going to do them. Oh, no one else going to do them. I guess I will. And the whole time you're doing the dishes, you're like angry washing them. And then you don't say anything.
Yeah.
And then next time they do something, you're like, oh yeah, just like this whole thing. It's like just conversation, man. Like just have these conversations. If something's bothering you, speak up. Right.